Good evening, everyone. My name is Judith Enck. I am the president of Beyond Plastics and a former regional administrator at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency appointed by President Obama. I do miss no drama Obama. And I'm on the faculty at Bennington College in Vermont. And we're delighted to have so many of you join us to talk about this vexing issue of vinyl chloride. You're going to be experts by the end of the hour, and we're going to share information and some actions that you can take. We're focusing on vinyl chloride because over 99% of vinyl chloride is used to make plastic, specifically polyvinyl chloride or PVC plastic. And at Beyond Plastics, we are a nationwide project that focuses on education, engagement, and advocacy. And we have called on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, along with many other of our partners, urging them to ban vinyl chloride in the United States. And it's because PVC plastic is the poison plastic. There are non-toxic alternatives for all of it. PVC is mostly used to make pipes for drinking water. Beyond Plastics put out a report, The Perils of Plastic Pipes, in April of this year. I was pleasantly reminded today that New York City, when they're replacing lead service lines, do not use PVC plastic pipes. The city of New York, all 8 million residents, their lead service lines are being replaced with copper piping, hopefully recycled copper. PVC is used for consumer packaging, vinyl siding on homes. PVC is used on children's toys. Your kid or grandkid probably grew up with this little character in the bathtub with them and quite possibly chewing on this. And I know when my son was young, I did not know that this was made from PVC plastic. Lots of health problems that we'll hear about tonight with exposure to vinyl chloride. It was designated a carcinogen in 1974. That same year, EPA wisely banned the use of vinyl chloride in hairsprays, refrigerants, cosmetics, and drugs. And I want to point out that was 49 years ago. 49 years ago that the federal government declared this toxin a carcinogen. Since then, PVC plastic has been banned in Canada, Spain, South Korea, and the Czech Republic. And even private companies that use PVC plastic are acknowledging the problem. This webinar tonight is very, very timely because we expect the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to make a decision very soon on whether or not to start the process under federal law of reconsidering the many uses of vinyl chloride. You'll hear about that tonight. I am so excited to introduce our two speakers who you will learn from. And I want to start by saying I'm very sorry that the person who was going to moderate this panel, my wonderful colleague, Dr. Megan Wolf, has been hit with some bad weather. So her internet is out, and not only that, her road is unpassable. She probably would have walked many miles to moderate this tonight, but you're stuck with me. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. He will present, and then I'll introduce our second speaker, and then we'll open things up for questions. We are over the moon to welcome Dr. David Rosner as our speaker this evening. Professor Rosner is the Ronald H. Lauderstein Professor of Socio-Medical Studies and Professor of History in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Columbia University. He is also co-director of the Center for the History of Ethics of Public Health at Columbia's School of Public Health. And he is the author of a book that we are all rereading as fast as we can, called Deceit and Denial: The Deadly Politics of Industrial Pollution. co-authored by Dr. Rosner and also Dr. Gerald Markowitz. It's an old book. It's a little thick. Most of it deals with lead and vinyl chloride. And I highly recommend that folks take a look at this. And then I'm happy to announce that in about 7 months, David Rosner will have a new book out published by Columbia University Press entitled Building the Worlds That Kill Us: Disease, Death, and Inequality from the Colonial Era to Climate Change. And as negotiators are furiously wrapping up the UN COP meeting today, this could not be more timely. So I'm happy to present to you Dr. David Rosner.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm really pleased to talk to you and to try to make some of my bizarre historical work a little relevant to some of the debates of today. I'm going to give the talk I'm going to give in the short time I have will be partly really the history of the discovery of the dangers of vinyl chloride and the response of industry to those dangers. It's based, can I share my screen now, do you think? Is that possible?
If you should be getting
Yes.
Yeah. Get me off. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay. Basically, it's going to be a quick review of how this became such a pervasive problem in American culture and American society, how it really is a product of the end of World War II and the 1960s and the 1970s, when it became a mainstay of virtually everything in our life. I'm going to show you some slides just to remind you, for those of you who are as old as I am, these will be very familiar. Just in this one picture, you can see vinyl became used widely in American culture, from everything to clothing, through art. This is a sandwich wrapped in vinyl chloride, a giant sandwich about 6 feet long by Roy Lichtenstein, and in children's toys, are just a few of the things that had entered into our world in the 1950s and 1960s. By the 1970s, it was in the bottles that was used to store our alcohol. It was on the side of our homes. It was in the plastic bottles that we drank Coke out of, that we're beginning to drink Coke out of. It was in the hairspray that went into that millions of women in the era of big hair used to use to get ready every morning. They were literally spraying themselves with vinyl chloride, which was used as a propellant. By the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the vinyl industry expanded enormously. And here's just a picture of one of the plants along the Mississippi that literally encompassed a whole community and a whole part of the river, and pouring poisons into it. Here's a map of the various vinyl chloride plants that lined the Mississippi and also lined other parts of the country, but Mississippi especially bad. By the 1960s, the only response we had to the fact that there were explosions and air pollution and all sorts of problems with these plants that were expanding wildly was to put in place a shelter-in-place system in which people in the community who were being exposed to the fumes coming out of these plants and the pollution from these plants were literally told to stay in their homes. These were largely African-American communities at that time, basically old sugar plantations and cotton plantations that had been brought by the chemical industry, and basically the workers who worked in these plants were largely living in shacks. These are some of the shacks. This is a picture that I took when I was going along the river, when I was looking for one of the old towns in my index that I wanted to see, and I couldn't find it. And I finally stopped off at a cemetery, the only thing that was in this area. And I asked the women who were kind of keeping tabs of the cemetery where Mount Hope was. And she said, this is it. And what it was a cemetery that had been surrounded by chemical plants. The whole town had literally been destroyed by the chemical industry that began taking over this community and basically moving people out. one of the ways in which the industry expanded was basically buying out old areas of the river and literally dispersing the people who were there, forcing them out one way or the other, either by polluting their land and then buying them out with little money, or alternatively having them moved by the state as part of an eminent domain process. But this kind of symbolized for me what was going on along the Mississippi during this period of time. That basically the plantations were being taken over by these chemical industries that were in turn displacing and destroying the communities that were there. In the 1960s, they became very, very aware of a couple of big issues that began to dominate their concerns. They noticed in the Goodrich plants of Louisville and in other places that workers who were working with vinyl chloride in mixing and creating polymers were developing a very strange disease that destroyed the bones in their hands and some of their ankles, and a disease called acrosteolysis. You can see here a picture of some of the workers whose limbs literally became foreshortened. Their bones dissolved, and slowly their hands became smaller and smaller as their fingers retreated. That was the first disease that really was of concern to the industry, that this was not just a benign little product that could be introduced into the mainstream of American life so casually, but actually might have repercussions for the workforce. The second disease that was identified mainly when some Italian researchers, Maltoni and Viola, came over after doing animal studies in Italy, and discovered that rats were dying of a very, very rare kind of liver cancer, a cancer that was so rare that you didn't expect to see more than 1 or 2, 3 cases in the United States in any given year. And yet the rats were dying at a very high rate. The disease was angiosarcoma of the liver, a very rare cancer. This was kind of a big shock for the industry as well, and led to a whole set of campaigns that basically were aimed at trying to keep these issues quiet, because they realized they had invested enormous amounts in this industry. It was extremely profitable. They had found places around the country where it was extremely cheap to make. Louisiana, just incidentally, is built on two parts of the polymer that are absolutely essential. One, on salt domes, giant quantities of salt that undergird the state of Louisiana, that can be very easily brought up and converted into NaCl, sodium chloride, 2 atoms that can be separated through electrolysis and can be used in creating the chloride part of the vinyl chloride monomer. So they have the water in the Mississippi, and they have the salt in the ground, and they have a government in Louisiana that literally was begging these industries to come there and begging them to build these plants in this place. They wanted essentially to keep the problems that they were trying to find quiet as possible, as they say. They want to make sure that this does not become a public issue, that it's not something that the government will pay attention to or the populations will pay attention to. They basically began to set up a whole system by which they tried to keep confidential the information that was emanating first from Europe and then in the United States itself about the rats that were developing angiosarcoma of the liver, but also at first acrosteolysis. They wanted to try to discourage or to influence the wording of any article that was coming out in newspapers in the area. Their goal, again, was literally to keep things quiet. They went to the extent of actually going to the doctors, to Dr. Wilson in Brussels, to see if he could stop the publication of the Solvay doctor who allegedly had at least 2 cases occur in the Solvay plant. They were going to Europe to try to stop the publication, trying to keep quiet here. I am to keep in contact with Goodrich. At present, there, Dr. Wilson is on his way to Brussels to see if he can stop a publication of a paper by a Solvay doctor who allegedly had at least 2 cases occur in the Solvay plant, which exhibited the same bone destruction that occurred in the Goodrich cases. Their particular issue, why they became so concerned in the 1960s, was because shortly before this period, this discovery, a book had appeared by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring. I think we all probably, of the people watching, are probably completely aware of what this book was, but it literally was a launch for the environmental movement and the awareness of the chemical industry and its impact on the country. It alerted the country to the dangers of DDT and alerted the dangers of the various polychlorinated hydrocarbons that were being produced by the industry. The second book they were really concerned was Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed. They wanted to make sure that the vinyl chloride industry did not get tainted by the attention that had been caused by Silent Spring and Unsafe at Any Speed. The problem was the issue, unfortunately for them, kind of broke into the open. Enough information was coming from Europe. There were enough discoveries in local areas and local communities that were being affected by angiosarcoma and osteolysis. And the creation of cancers began to appear in local newspapers as well as the New York Times. Rare liver cancer discovered in 2 more at a chemical plant. These kinds of articles that began to accrue made the industry especially paranoid about whether or not they might be actually regulated. We have to remember that in the 1970s, we had actually created the first 2 major institutions in government that were responsible for both controlling the environment as well as workers' health. We had the OSHA Act passed in 1970, and then NIA and NIASH along with it was organized in 1970, which was aimed at protecting the workforce. And second was the Environmental Protection Agency, which also had been created in 1970. So they were terrified that the EPA would pick up on these articles and begin to institute controls over the industry that was so profitable for them. This was the major issue that really captured them, not necessarily just the hairspray. But until the 1970s, the issue is mainly identified as primarily a workers' problem, people working in the vinyl chloride plants. But with the development of angiosarcoma of the liver and the realization that they were literally introducing vinyl into the widespread consumer economy, they wondered and worried that they had a giant liability set of suits that were going to hit them. A major issue, of course, was the fact that, as I mentioned before, women were using it virtually every day. They were spraying themselves with thousands of times the actual accepted safe limit that was even in place at that time. Every day they were spraying it literally into their face. And so this was a possible giant liability problem. In some cases, it says, this is from 1969, right? The toxicity of vinyl chloride monomer. In some cases where the duration of spraying is long, 3 minutes, the concentration may be as high as 1,400 parts per million. All of this suggests that beauty operators, at this point, they're still worried about the worker, may be exposed to concentrations of VCL monomer equal or greater than to the level of our polymers. So this was a major problem. The people in the cosmetics trades have been concerned about the possible toxicity of these propellants, they say. In this one, this is another memo from 1973. Dow uses and has advised all of its customers to use 50 parts per million as a TLV, as a threshold limit for VCM. It would like to get out of the sale of VCM as aerosol propellants, but doesn't know quite how to do it. Thinking behind this was not explored, but suspect that fear is of a spotlighting of the health concerns. Dow no longer makes PVC, and there is less than 1 part per million VCM in saran wrap. It was even in saran wrap that we were wrapping our food in was leaching into food. So their concern was they wanted to get, even the companies that wanted to get out of the business didn't really want to spotlight the health concerns, because this would just open up a can of worms for all of them about what they had been doing. They wanted to avoid triggering problems with our employees by pinpointing the reason of the studies. They would try to do studies of the epidemiology of this disease, of these diseases, but they didn't know how to do it without revealing the fact that they were worried, and that they were worried that this stuff was really dangerous. One of their employees suggested that they avoid interviews if possible, and if not, make it, quote, general health, end quote, and logical, maybe an extension of the hand problem studies. The hand problem studies that happened in the 60s, now they're worried about the cancers, and they're trying to find out about cancer, but they don't want to let them know that they're worried about cancer, because it will alert them to be concerned themselves. Their response essentially, and I'm racing through this because I know that I'm only have 20 minutes. So what their decision to do was to basically all agree never to talk about the problem. They decided to sign what they called a secrecy agreement. The Manufacturing Chemists Association promulgated a secrecy agreement in which, and this is a copy from the Dow Chemical Company that was signed, that would keep all information about the dangers of their products secret, not only from the public, but from government itself. That no one could talk about the studies that they were doing and the dangers that they felt were inherent in their product. Well, let me just go back. In this one, their concern was if they had a strictly confidential secrecy agreement, right, that they worry that there was actually an aspect of moral obligation not to withhold from government significant information having occupational environmental relevance, and the desirability of industry taking the initiative rather than in some later time having to defend another course. So their concern was if they signed the secrecy agreement and they knew they had this information and they kept it from the public and they kept it from the government, were they in some sense breaking some kind of moral obligation they had to the society? That was quickly answered when they said they recognized that they were actually breaking their moral obligation to the society. Here they said, the March 26th letter that I just showed you could be construed as evidence of an illegal conspiracy by industry if the information were not made public or at least made available to the government. This was their policy, not to talk about it, not to tell anybody about it, not to reveal any of the information that they were accumulating. But they were presented with a problem because NIOSH, which was a relatively new organization, for those of you all probably know what it is, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, asked them to come to Washington to talk about what the possible dangers of their product were, what was happening, what was going on in their industry, what did they know about vinyl chloride. And they were being called to the government in order to report on their findings. The problem was they were caught between having signed a secrecy agreement among themselves, right, and having to report to the government honestly what was going on. We don't really know what happened. What happened in this meeting. All we know is that they came out of it very happy. They came out of the NIOSH meeting feeling, as I said, the consensus of the MCA group and Dr. Duffield was that the presentation was extremely well received and that the chances of precipitous action by NIOSH on vinyl chloride were materially lessened. It's kind of a vacuum because they had actually gone to the meeting and they asked NIOSH not to take notes, and they themselves were not supposed to take notes as well, so that they didn't really have any formal recording of what happened. But all we really know is that they came out happy. Needless to say, any breach of the presentation's informal confidentiality could be extremely costly to the industry. In other words, we know what happened to that meeting, but we better not let it out, right? This was dangerous to the industry. I'm going to really wrap it up here more or less, but basically by the 1970s and 1980s, late 1970s and early 1980s, the environmental movement had become strong enough. The country had become aware enough of the dangers, not only of vinyl, but of polychlorinated biphenyls, of DDT, and a whole series of chemicals that had really been introduced into the society after the World War II. And there began to be really strong movements and marches in the community I followed. These are just a couple of the pictures. This is from the Louisiana Toxic March, and this is another march in 1988. So this begins to accelerate throughout the 90s. This is the last slide I have. Really, is just by the 1990s, signs were being put up along the strip of Mississippi River, in which these industries were building their plants, and they began to designate the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans as Cancer Alley. This is welcome to the gateway to Cancer Alley. Here, workers are striking against BASF chemical industry, German industry that had built a plant then, and they were advertising it as a entrance to Cancer Alley. Here again, Greenpeace was again identifying on the same. You can see, if you look closer, you'll see this is Batman and Robin over here, and they're over a sign that says "Play safe, don't buy vinyl toys." So the social movements that begin around vinyl in the 1970s, that are first a professional movement, first built into government and professionals discussing it, but break out into the open and break out into these larger movements, are really the legacy that we're now living with, which is that we're all aware of these dangers, and we all have to find ways of really controlling them. So I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry I went on so long, but you had a 20-minute version of a 300-page book, so you should be grateful.
And, and I'm sorry we don't have more time, but that is just a little appetizer for your book, Deceit and Denial, which was published, I will say, in 2002. What is so right?
No, it was republished in 2012 with a new conclusion. So,
oh, good. All right, we're up to 2012. What is so striking is the dates. How long regulatory agencies have known about the dangers, both occupational and in the general population. And two things I took away from this is you have so many confidential memos, but when it says strictly confidential, I really pay attention. And second, as a former EPA official, I can't imagine doing a meeting and being told not to take notes and not to record the conversation. So as a former federal official, that was deeply disappointing to learn about that. So we are now, we've got this history and all of this data that has been known for decades. And now we are fast forwarding to February of 2023 this year. And we are transitioning this conversation so you can hear from my colleague, Jess Connor. Jess is a licensed medical speech language pathologist who was launched into high-profile advocacy following the toxic train derailment, which involved a vinyl chloride spill in her hometown of East Palestine, Ohio. And not just in her hometown, but literally a mile and a half or 2 miles from her backyard, where Jess and her family live. We're so fortunate that Jess joined the Beyond Plastics staff this past August, and she is our first Appalachia director, where she speaks on both national and global platforms, advocating for safer solutions for plastic pollution, including urging the Biden administration to ban vinyl chloride, use their existing authorities and have the EPA ban vinyl chloride. So I'm delighted to introduce Jess to all of you.
Thank you so much, Judith, and to the Beyond Plastics team for honoring my testimony once again on such a notable platform with Professor Rosner. Your information is invaluable to this fight, and I'm so grateful to be sharing this platform with you today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I live in East Palestine, Ohio, as many of you know. I've lived here generationally with my family. There are streets, roads, housing units that are named after my family. So this is a place that is very special to me. Prior to February, I was a speech language pathologist. So this certainly wasn't on my 2023 career goals, but this has been incredibly impactful for my community in the surrounding areas. And I'm really excited to be the Appalachia Director for Beyond Plastics. East Palestine and surrounding areas are still in desperate need of the emergency declaration, which I'll have Andrew drop in the chat. If you could just take 15 seconds to sign that to bring relief to my community, we are still in need of that. East Palestine, if you don't know already, is a really small, quiet, very rural community. It's a great place to raise a family. And the train actually runs right through my backyard. Here's the downtown area. It's just so quaint and sweet. I love it. But this is what my backyard sounds like on a normal day. Unfortunately, on Friday, February 3rd, a Norfolk Southern train carrying 700,000 gallons of vinyl chloride and other toxic chemicals derailed just over 2 miles from my home. My town started to feel like a war zone in that moment, and the train was actually on fire when it passed through this window here. Emergency calls actually started coming in about an hour before it passed through my town, and yet we had no warning. It was essentially a bomb train that was headed our way, and it was on fire. Once the train derailed, nearly half of my town was forced to evacuate. And this fire was roughly a half a mile long. We were advised at this point, and maybe you'll remember this from Professor Rosner's speech, we were advised to shelter in place. There was a mandatory evacuation zone a few days later, but as for my family being 2 miles out, we were all advised to shelter in place. In the days and hours that followed, according to the Center for Disease Control, this decision to shelter in place did cause my family and neighbors and friends, the people that grew me, to be exposed to toxic chemicals. As the weekend unfolded, we began to hear about the dangerous contents of the train. So at this point, we still didn't know what was on the train. And there was potentially going to be a catastrophic explosion. On Monday morning, February 6th, we were told an explosion of a car containing vinyl chloride was imminent. The plan was to prevent the spontaneous explosion of this rail car by performing what we now know as a vent and burn. And it was supposed to be one rail car, but ended up being 5. We still today don't have answers of why they burned or released and burned 5 cars into a ditch. Purposely put on fire. My family at this point was still instructed to shelter in place. However, the closer we got to the time of the vent and burn, the more news that we received about a possible weather inversion. This inversion would potentially cause the chemical burnoff to remain in the town rather than to blow away. So it was at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon that Monday that I made the decision to evacuate my family. I loaded up my children and 3 days worth of clothes, and we drove out of town. When we returned, all we could see was a massive cloud of black billowing smoke. And this is a photo from my back porch on February 6th. The following week, our home was filled with a thick chemical smell, and we were told the smell was not toxic, but we now know that was not the truth. The chemicals spilled into the soil and into the waterways and killed many aquatic animals. It traveled by water, what we were told, at least 7.5 miles. The toxic air plume extended at least 30 miles into Ohio and the neighboring Appalachian states. According to some universities, we're now finding out that it's likely these toxins in the air and waterways possibly traveled hundreds of miles, but the EPA decided not to follow it. On February 23rd, the National Transportation Safety Board said that the train derailment was 100% preventable. During a hearing held by the NTSB in June, so this past summer, the owners of the vinyl chloride in the notorious vent and burn said that they repeatedly advised officials that a vent and burn was not necessary. Many people in my community began speaking out, and in the past 11 months now, I have been launched like a rocket into advocacy. Unfortunately, after all of this, the creeks, some homes and businesses, our park, and other areas of my town potentially remain highly contaminated. We continue to hear from government authorities that it is safe, but we can still see and smell the chemicals. These are the million-gallon tanks that are still in my community, and the officials that are present when you approach these tanks call these freshwater tanks. So I don't think that looks like fresh water, but that's what they call them. We continue to hear from government officials and government authorities that it's safe here, but we can still see and smell these chemicals. Our acute illnesses like rashes, nosebleeds, red cheeks, and headaches persist, and we still have no testing for our bodies and no assessments for our homes for these chemicals. Following the derailment, the CDC recognized that my community had been poisoned by the plume of chemicals. And while they announced that there's nothing that could be done about exposures, they would be sure to treat our cancers.
Oh, sweet.
The corporate polluter has purchased the heart and minds of my community, from plastering their logo on every event held to donating money to youth sports, new fire equipment, among other things, including $50,000 in teacher appreciation gift cards. But we still have nothing to test our homes for these chemicals, and we still have no medical resources. This could have been prevented, and we have the ability to prevent another one. My home is now a sacrifice zone. We know already, because of the mounds of research, that vinyl chloride used to make PVC plastics that was on that train is driven by the fossil fuel industry. The unnecessary use, the single use, and PVC plastics continue to drive climate disasters, pollute communities, and fill our bodies with microplastics, all in the name of profit. You can draw a straight line from what happened in East Palestine to what is happening with plastics. Vinyl chloride is transported by rail all over the country. It's the same chemical that contaminated and destroyed the several other communities already mentioned by Professor Rosner. The vinyl chloride plant in Morrison, Louisiana, which replaced the community's sugar and cotton fields due to the corporate demand for PVC plastic production. Not community demand, corporate demand. And toxic releases in this community just became a part of their life. They were told the same thing: shelter in place, close the doors, close the windows. Another example out of Louisiana, home of the Georgia Gulf, which is a major PVC producer, also spewed vinyl chloride and its byproducts into the air and into the water. The social injustice was the same as East Palestine. Again, the company dispersed residents, which is what has happened here, severed community ties, and created a deep division, which is exactly what is happening in my home today. Another example, Mossville, Louisiana, whose residents I had the absolute pleasure of meeting recently. The same thing, a major vinyl chloride producing corporation bought out the town due to the significant toxic consequences, and this town has been left and forgotten. There are more communities that have and will suffer from PVC and the production of vinyl chloride. And as we learn from the situation in East Palestine, it's not a singular event, as some would have you believe. If you live along a rail line, you're at risk for this same fate. PVC has actually already been banned in a lot of food packaging in Canada, South Korea. It's time to take on the need to ban it now in America. The disaster that happened in my community is a symptom and yet another grim warning of the cost of plastics and the inevitable dangers of vinyl chloride production and transportation. None of the so-called assistance programs seem to address the challenges that we face every day, including the daily question that I ask myself, is it safe here? My assumption is, like those other communities, it's probably not. As my community continues to grapple with the aftermath of the derailment and the chemical spill, I have decided that I am not going to continue to act like this is a rare event or that I'm a singular community in this fight, because that is simply not the truth. It's time to ban vinyl chloride yesterday. But here we are, so let's get to it. Collectively, we can be unstoppable in this fight, and I don't know about you, but I am determined to leave a cleaner and healthier world for my children and for all of yours.
Thank you so much, Jess. Really, really important, inspiring words. Thank you. We have some resources to share. We already dropped in the chat a petition to urge the federal government to do emergency declaration in East Palestine, which, believe it or not, still hasn't happened all these months later. Andrew will also drop in the chat a live petition we have to the EPA, urging them to use their existing authorities to ban vinyl chloride. And again, over 99% of vinyl chloride is used to make PVC, polyvinyl chloride plastic. If you live in a community where your lead service lines for drinking water are finally being replaced, please take a look at our report earlier this year on PVC pipes. There's also a really important documentary that was recently released by an organization called the Years Project. Just Google that when you're done. I'm sure you're going to run out of time soon and you're going to want to hear more. Go to our website or the Year Project documentary. It's a 20-minute film on vinyl chloride with a real focus on East Palestine. So what you heard tonight was the history and the current reality. We have some time for questions from all of you here. I think the best thing is to use the raise hand feature, and I will call on people. Try to keep your questions as short as possible. We'll do a little bit of a lightning round so we can get to a lot of people, and we'll start with Tricia Gorman. Please tell us where you're from and what your question is.
I'm from Oakland, California, and my question is the oil industry fighting back? I would assume they are, against EPA banning vinyl chloride, and what are they doing now?
It's mostly being fought by an outfit called the Vinyl Institute. They are trying to tie the EPA in knots and prevent them from taking action. And that's why vinyl chloride has been on EPA's work plan for chemical assessments since 2014. and they're just getting to making a decision very soon on whether or not to address this. But yeah, Tricia, chemicals, plastics are made from chemicals and fossil fuels. So whenever a regulatory agency tries to do something bold or highly effective, there's opposition from fossil fuel companies, chemical companies, and plastics companies all together. But, there's also lots of people power, people who are concerned about health and the environment, and that's how we have to counter this in the years ahead. Did that answer your
Thank you.
question?
Yes, thank you.
Let's see, Andrew, could you go full screen so I can see everyone? Did I already call on Amy Fass?
No.
Okay, Amy, you're next.
Yeah, actually, this is more for Jess. Well, there's two things. You said that that they dispersed residents, and what does that actually consist of in this context?
Yeah, so in my town, what has happened is there are folks that really want to be safe in their homes, and in order to do that, they don't feel that they can remain on site. And so they have asked for temporary relocation. And as a result, actually, some of those relocated residents have now obtained residency elsewhere. And it really impacted our election this year, which I thought was really interesting. We had quite a few folks that weren't able to participate in the election because they were considered living outside of the community for more than 6 months, even though they're living in a hotel. So this has been quite a feat to try to gain access to what we need, because we're constantly having to go back to the polluter to get our needs met.
Oh,
So it's dispersed us in more ways than one, and I think politically is probably been the most important one.
well. And I said the second thing was, I think I heard something about this on NPR this morning, on Morning Edition. Could anybody confirm that? I think it's been a series, at least the last couple of days.
I am not aware.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we'll now go to the phone. Someone with the phone number 814-590-0558. Do you have a question? You need to come off mute.
Oh, sorry.
Hello, this is Laura Rosenberger Hyder. I also noticed problems with the plastic from where they're produced, from the oil wells. There's gaps in the casing in California. There's an upward pressure from the oil wells into the water aquifer and bringing salt water up, and all the oil pollution and hydrocarbons, and it's like a mess, and the Tulare aquifer is in danger in California.
Thank you for that point. I'd also
The USGS survey that was about just today in a webinar. State of California, EPA.
thank you. Plastics is a fossil fuel industry for sure. Historically, plastics were made from chemicals and oil. Now it's mostly made from chemicals and ethane, a byproduct of fracking, mostly gas, a little bit of oil. So there's a real marriage between plastics and fossil fuels. So it's smart to pay attention to every step of the production level. We'll now go to Sarah Tanja, please.
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much for this webinar and for the education. I've been getting through it. I'm wondering, what are the legal requirements for the polluters in situations like this to clean up? Like, how much do they have to clean up? How do they have to prove that they've done it? Yeah, like, are there legal requirements? I hope there
Yes.
are.
Yeah, there definitely are, Sarah. At first, I thought you said, what are the lethal requirements? But what are the legal requirements? This cleanup will be overseen by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency with support from the Ohio state agency known as Ohio EPA. There are cleanup standards that need to be met for soil, for instance. We know that there are real concerns about toxics in the sediment of creeks and streams. So the sediment may need to be dredged. I think a real failing of the regulatory program, and I say this as a former EPA regional administrator, is when the unprecedented decision was made to drain 5 train cars of vinyl chloride into ditches and then purposely set it on fire. There was really no regulatory protection for when that was happening. And you've seen the iconic big black plume that traveled a long distance. EPA did not set up any kind of monitoring along the plume, and EPA has failed to comprehensively test inside people's homes. Quite late, they did go look for vinyl chloride, but we know that when you burn vinyl chloride, other material is often created, including dioxin. EPA was very slow to even test for dioxin. When they did, after community outrage, they tested soil, and that was a month after lots of heavy rains. So there is a regulatory system that will govern the cleanup. If the company doesn't cooperate, EPA refers a case to the U.S. Department of Justice. But that very early stage, I would argue there was a real regulatory failure. We'll now go to Gail Ladd.
Hi, thank you for all of this information, and thank you, Jess. I mean, my heart just, hurts. So I hope we get some kind of relief pretty soon. But you did mention, Judith, in the very beginning, that there were alternatives to the use of the PVC, the vinyl chloride, and other countries are banning it. So is it money? Or yeah, I kind of figured that's what it was. But I'm hoping that with all of this that we can get it banned here too. The United States seems to lag behind, unfortunately, in a lot of the safety.
Yeah, I mean, it's really companies that produce the vinyl chloride and then companies that use it to make PVC plastic. They believe that it's cheap. It's not really cheap when you look at all of the environmental externalities. And the reason why Beyond Plastics has focused on this one chemical so intensely since February is because we know we have a very rickety rail system, and every day vinyl chloride and many other toxic chemicals are moving by rail all over the country. And we know who lives next to the tracks. It's typically low-income communities, communities of color, making this a very prominent environmental justice issue. So we're going to go quickly. We have 2 hands up. Then we're probably going to wrap up. We'll go to Meredith Felton and then Heidi Siegfried.
Hi, thanks. I just want to know if you could tell us what are some of the most common products that vinyl chlorides are used in and for?
Sure. Children's toys. So if you're buying toys for your kids over the holidays, I personally would avoid PVC toys for children, especially if they're little ones who chew on the toys. It is used for flooring in homes. Vinyl siding is very common. So firefighters are quite interested in this issue of what happens when houses are on fire. You know, the major cause of death for firefighters historically has been heart attacks. Now the major cause of death among our firefighters is cancer. It's also used in consumer packaging, including packaging that touches our food. So there are a bunch of major companies that are part of the U.S. Plastics Pact and they have agreed to voluntarily stop using vinyl chloride, PVC plastic, particularly in consumer packaging. But this is voluntary, and there's a bad history of companies not honoring their voluntary pledges. So these companies announced that they're going to stop using PVC plastic by 2025. The companies are Target, Walmart, Nestle, Aldi's, Unilever, and many more. So building materials, children's toys, pipes. Oh my gosh, how could I forget pipes? PVC plastic piping used for both drinking water and wastewater. Those are the giant categories. Heidi.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that you didn't mention the name of the train company, and I don't know if there might be a reason for it, but that Norfolk Southern came from Albany through Cobleskill, Oneonta, New York, with this Toys for Tots train, distributing 50-cent teddy bears, wearing Norfolk Southern t-shirts and 10-cent train whistles, and so I earlier, because I work on health policy, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in November had a really interesting one-day thing about East Palestine, and they started out with a panel of people that were affected, and then a panel of people, providers that had to respond. And I'm sure Jess probably knows about this. And the panel of people that were affected actually was coordinated by religious people in the town, clergy. And so anyway, it was just appalling to me on a Saturday to see this, having witnessed this National Academy thing. And I did speak at my church the next day about this, and I lit a candle for the people of East Palestine. And I do feel, especially seeing that religious leaders in East Palestine have been organizing on this, that this, would be another place we can organize. And also, when these trains come through our town, they make themselves a target. So I'm glad that I have an action now that I can ask people to do. And I think, we have to look for points of organization. So these stupid Toys for Tots trains are a good point to say, hey, you don't get to distribute teddy bears and forget the people of East Palestine.
Judith, if I could say, there's a lot of improvements that need to happen with rail safety. I don't think that that's been hidden in any way by what happened in East Palestine, but train derailments are not uncommon. And had this train derailment been an issue of, having hemp or wheat or mycelium products, which are all safe alternatives for PVC, my community would not be in the position that it's in. So the reason that my community was uprooted is specifically because of the massive amounts of vinyl chloride that it was carrying, and that were purposely drained and burned in order to get the train moving again. So yes, rail safety, but the root of the problem here in my town is the vinyl chloride.
Thank you, Jess. And I am afraid we're running out of time, but Jess, I want you to just talk briefly again about the request to the federal government for an emergency declaration for East Palestine, because in addition to contacting the EPA urging them to ban vinyl chloride, which would be very timely for you to reach out quickly, this other action is equally important. Jess, you want to talk about it for a minute?
Yeah, I appreciate the space to talk about that. So my community of East Palestine at this point really only has one option for any sort of financial resource, and that unfortunately is at the hands and discretion of the polluter, for which we have no guidelines, we have no appeals process to meet any individual needs. And unfortunately, it seems as though the process has been very biased, at least from my perspective. If we were to gain access to the emergency declaration, we would have opportunities to test our homes for the chemicals that were sprayed. We would have opportunities to test our bodies, to have long-term medical monitoring, and to make sure that we're not going bankrupt in the process. This is something that's really important for my community. It would also provide us relief for those of us that are closest to the creeks, which are still highly contaminated, as well as to the derailment site, which you know, as much cleanup as they're doing, it's such a mess over there, and really, really difficult to contain that contamination any way you look at it. So there really is a stigma right now of living over there, and a morality of potentially selling your home that could be contaminated without any testing. So it's hard for people to get out right now. The emergency declaration would provide us with a lot of resources that we currently only have at the discretion of the polluter, which it was just announced that they are removing the temporary relocation assistance for the folks that are still relocated. So I think at this point, I'd like to see the government act as more like an insurance agent or insurance agency. So when you are in a car accident, you don't take your medical bills to the liable party. You don't take your car repairs to the liable party. You take them to your insurance company. So it would be nice to have the federal government step in and provide that mediation service, provide that appeal service, provide the emergency agency services that we have in place so that my community can be well cared for moving forward. An emergency declaration would help greatly in this area.
Thanks, Jess. So I lied. One final question from Jenny Gitlitz, and then we will wrap up.
Jess, you mentioned that this event has divided your community. Is your community divided because some people trust Norfolk Southern to make them whole and others don't?
There is a serious co-op happening. You nailed it, Jenny. The polluter has plastered their logo all over town, really trying to almost like a Stockholm syndrome situation where there are some folks of the community that have really snuggled up to the financial backing, to the promise of a new park, to the promise of, you know, money coming in from certain spaces. But there are people that are actually suffering. They've gone as far as to put railroad tracks on the football player helmets our mascot is the bulldog, so that doesn't really make any sense. But there is a serious co-op happening. And in my discussions with folks from the Gulf South, from Louisiana, I've met with folks from Texas, areas in West Virginia that have also been impacted by the petrochemical industry. This type of co-op thing does happen time after time after time, and it makes it difficult for communities to rally against these big polluters as a result. So you nailed it. There's division because people experience this differently, and the PR campaigns are top notch, and unfortunately it makes for a lot of gaslighting and needs not being met. It's unfortunate.
I did notice a week after the toxic train derailment in East Palestine, the polluter was using the same phrases that were used with the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster in the Gulf. They must have the same PR firm. So I want to specifically thank 4 people. I want to thank Dr. Megan Wolf, who helped pull together this webinar, and she'll see the recording. I want to thank our colleague Andrew Craigie, who makes everything appear effortless and seamless, and it's never effortless. Thank you, Andrew. Jess, for your amazing ability to take a real serious personal tragedy and turn it into political action. And our hero, Dr. David Rosner, who has documented the devastating impact of vinyl chloride and lead and other contaminants. Thanks for being so generous with your time. Don't worry, you will get a follow-up email from us, which will include the recording and a couple specific action items. And we are really counting on the Biden administration, EPA, to do the right thing very soon. If they announce that they're starting the process of banning vinyl chloride, it'll take many years to get to the end. It's a very tedious process governed by federal law, but the first step is for EPA to make an announcement of what their intention is. So thanks everyone for joining us. Happy holidays. Take care. Good night.